A modest beginning in a small southern town in America, nestled deep within the heartland of the American South, lay a small, unassuming town where life moved slow, and the people lived simpler lives. It was the kind of community where everyone knew everyone and everyone's business. In this town lived John Miller, a young man bearing the quiet, stoic demeanor of someone who had learned early on to keep his head down and endure what life dealt him. John was born into a humble working-class family with little to their name, but plenty of resilience to keep them going. His father, Charlie Miller, was a machinist at the small power plant on the outskirts of town, the type of job that came with a paycheck just big enough to scrape by but left no room for luxuries or unexpected expenses. His mother, Mary Ann Miller, was the cornerstone of the family. She was resourceful and unyieldingly hard-working, a woman who had sacrificed every ounce of her dreams to keep the family afloat. John was the youngest of 4 children, arriving at a time when the Miller household was already stretched thin. His siblings, 2 older brothers and 1 sister, took various odd jobs to pitch in, but they were still only kids themselves and didn't have much to offer. By the time John was 5, tragedy struck the family when Charlie fell ill with pneumonia. The lack of health insurance meant that the Millers couldn't afford the proper care that might have saved him. Charlie passed away in the dead of winter, leaving a void in the family both emotionally and financially. Mary Ann, widowed at just 36, was left to shoulder the burden of raising 4 children completely on her own. Despite the somber cloud of poverty that hung over their modest 2-bedroom house, the Miller family was held together by Mary Ann's fierce determination. She was a devout Christian, and it was her faith and sense of duty to her children that kept her going, even when neighbors whispered behind her back about how she let her boys roam wild, or how one of her girls had torn, hand-me-down dresses that didn't quite fit right. John, even as a young boy, had a knack for helping out wherever he could. While other kids in town spent long, sunny afternoons swimming in the nearby creek or playing stickball in empty lots, John was usually stacking firewood, walking a mile to fetch water, or hand-weeding the vegetable garden they relied on to keep food on the table. Those early years shaped him into someone who understood the necessity of hard work, but also someone who learned to look at life through a quiet lens of disappointment. He heard the grown-ups talk when they thought he wasn't listening, that the Millers were just barely making it, that young John Miller don't stand a chance to get out of this place. School life offered no sanctuary either. John, bearing his father's strong jawline and piercing blue eyes, was shy and introverted, often sitting in the back of the classroom and avoiding attention. While he was no slouch in his studies, John's real strength lay in his hands. He had a natural ability with tools, something Charlie had taught him in the rare father-son moments they had. But being good with tools wasn't enough to escape the social stigma of growing up poor in their small community. Locals frequently set low expectations for boys like John, assuming they'd either settle into the mill or spend their lives grazing by on out-of-season farming work. Mary Ann, for all her struggles, was John's champion. "The Lord gives to those who help themselves, Johnny," she always said, gently encouraging him to aim higher than the world expected. To remind him of his potential, she kept his father's worn Bible and passed-down pocket knife locked in a wooden chest, always emphasizing that these were things of men, items John would inherit when he was ready to shoulder the world's responsibility. Summer nights were both a time of heartbreak and solace. The family, unable to afford air conditioning, sat on their sagging front porch, listening to the symphony of crickets, but dreaming of something better. Mary Ann would often hum old hymn tunes, and despite the financial hardship, these were also moments of familial unity, moments when John could almost believe there was more for him waiting out there somewhere beyond the cracked roads of their sleepy town. But John's dreams, like most, didn't stretch very far. He longed to be a somebody, though he didn't have a roadmap to what that might be. What he did know was that he didn't want to end up like the men on Main Street who passed the time sitting on rusty lawn chairs outside Jameson's general store, swapping tales of regret over spit tobacco. John's view of the world was at once hopeful and restrained. He dared to want more but felt bound by circumstances to achieve less. The seeds of frustration were sown young, but they didn't bloom into anger just yet. Instead, they grew into quiet determination. For John Miller, the beginning of his story wasn't marked by ambition or audacious dreams, but by a stoic resolve to simply keep putting one foot in front of the other, hoping that one day somehow, it might lead him away from the small-town struggles he knew so well. A harsh coming of age, and the crush of social expectations. When John Miller turned 18, life in the small southern town seemed to offer him little in the way of opportunity. The town was locked in the rhythm of routine, where progress felt like a rumor rather than a reality. For a boy like John, born poor and raised without the privilege of connections or a well-funded education, the paths forward seemed predetermined. You either picked up a trade or joined the military. In John's case, the latter came not as a choice but as a necessity. John had barely made it through high school, not because he lacked the intelligence but because staying awake in class became harder when you had chores waiting before the sun rose. He worked part-time repairing old tractors and lawnmowers for a store on the edge of town, but the pay was pitiful, barely enough to help his mother keep milk on the table. The day he graduated, his brother offered him a handshake and a grim piece of advice. "You got two options," he said. "Stay here and rot like the rest of us, or get out and gamble with what's left out there." It wasn't much of a pep talk, but it was enough for John to pack what little he had and visit the local Army recruitment office the very next week. Boot camp was no picnic, but strangely, John found a taste of belonging he'd never experienced before. The rigors of military training demanded a level of discipline that he seemed pre-wired for, a stoic resilience inherited from his mother, and a willingness to follow orders honed over years of being the invisible kid. He wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest. But what John lacked in sheer athleticism, he made up for in quiet determination. His drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran of Vietnam, took a liking to John, often telling the other recruits, "That Miller boy might not talk much, but he does the job right. The world could use more of that kind of man." For a while, John thrived. The Army not only fed him 3 square meals a day but gave him a purpose. However, the truth about service was far from the hero's tale that military ads painted. The South's economic stagnation meant that many recruits had signed up out of desperation rather than patriotism, and John soon found himself rubbing elbows with fractured men, some of them scarred emotionally from past wars, others hardened bullies merely biding time. The camaraderie he had hoped for was often replaced by harsh hazing and mockery over his small-town ways, especially when the other recruits ribbed him about his drawling accent or the hole-patched jeans he brought to basic training. "Hey, hayseed, how'd you even make it out of Hicksville?" one guy taunted in the barracks one night. "Do y'all ride tractors to school out there?" another jeered, flicking bunk crumbs in John's direction. John kept his head down but felt the sting of their words late at night. He couldn't help but wonder if they were right. If someday he'd be sent back to his crumbling hometown with nothing but failure and a paycheck for serving someone else's idea of freedom. By the time his first 3 years of service passed, John had survived unscathed, but his dreams of escaping poverty and his hometown left him disillusioned. The promotions went to men who were louder, flashier, more willing to stick their necks out or play politics. When he returned home after his service ended, John felt a conflicting blend of pride for his time in uniform and shame that his escape plan had ultimately failed. The thought of finding stable work back in town gnawed at him constantly. When he finally returned to his small southern town, he discovered that much of it remained unchanged, like a photograph left to yellow with age. The familiar sight of the old gas station and the weathered steeple of the town church filled John with longing and dread all at once. While he was gone, his mother had grown older, her once firm hands weakened by arthritis but still determined to manage the household. His siblings had scattered, some married off, others trapped in the same cycle of hourly wages and dreams deferred. John's attempts to find meaningful employment proved difficult. The best job he could manage was as a repairman at a local machine shop, fixing industrial equipment for the surrounding farms. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough to keep him afloat. The military had taught him how to work with precision, and his skill with tools became his greatest asset. Still, that sense of potential, the idea that he could escape the confines of what society expected from a born and bred small-town boy, hung heavy in his mind. Around town, old acquaintances treated him differently, now that he had a few years of military service under his belt. The more successful ones avoided meeting his gaze, while others offered him half-hearted congratulations mixed with thinly veiled pity. "I heard the Army'll make a man out of you," an old high school teacher told him one afternoon while shopping at the local general store. "Guess it didn't work out for you to stay longer, huh?" John forced a smile and gripped his grocery bag tighter. Conversations like these were becoming constants in his post-Army life. Social pressures from the tight-knit community began to build as well. In a town like theirs, where reputations preceded everyone, John found himself under scrutiny from neighbors and churchgoers alike. "When's John gonna settle down?" people would whisper at Sunday service. "He ain't got a wife or kids yet. Must be something wrong with the boy." The judgment, subtle but cutting, filled John with resentment. He hadn't even had time to dream beyond survival, yet the town seemed to insist on reminding him of his failures to meet traditional expectations. Worse still, every potential job or promotion felt like a losing game. Rejection letters were handed out by people who still saw him as that Miller boy, someone not destined for anything beyond greasy overalls and an old toolbox. Each no chipped away at his confidence. What stung the most wasn't their lack of belief in him, it was his growing belief that they were right. As the years dragged on, John began to embody his own worst fears. The quiet boy who once dared to dream of something greater was now a stoic, tired man trapped in the very life he'd tried so hard to escape. And even on the best of days, as he fixed one more outdated motor or tightened another rusted bolt, the bitter thought lingered. Maybe this was all there was for someone like him. A marriage of tolerance, and the seeds of tragedy, ****. By the time John Miller returned to his small southern town after completing his military service, there was an unspoken understanding in the community. It was time for him to settle down. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about his life. Friends from church would offer kind but pointed remarks like, "You know, John, there's this girl at the florist shop who'd make a fine wife," or, "It's about time you built a family of your own." The pressure wasn't overt, but it was constant, and when you lived in a close-knit, gossip-filled town, expectations weren't easy to escape. That was when Sarah entered his life. Sarah was a schoolteacher, sharp-minded, confident, with a spark in her smile that made her stand out among the quieter women in town. She was no Southern belle who sat back demurely, waiting to be courted. Sarah was ambitious, outspoken, and sometimes intimidating to the men of the community. But to John, who had spent years fading into the background, her lively energy seemed like something he needed, something he could tether himself to, as he tried to rebuild his directionless life. Their courtship wasn't exactly romantic by big city standards. Movie nights at the dusty local theater, dinners at the diner with chipped melamine plates. They didn't have much money or any particular chemistry, but they made it work. To Sarah, John represented a stable foundation, someone quiet, predictable, and, with his army background, reliable. To John, Sarah was a chance to step into the world of the somebodies, a woman who might elevate him above the reputation of being the Miller boy who'd never go far. Much of the town viewed the match as an uneven pairing. Most saw Sarah as the one with the upper hand, a spirited woman marrying a quiet, unremarkable man. "She'll whip him into shape real quick," John overheard someone say at the hardware store one morning. By the time their engagement was announced, it felt less like a love story, and more like an inevitable arrangement. For John, it was a win to land someone like Sarah. For Sarah, it was a practical step forward in her life. The wedding was modest, held in the town's Baptist church one Sunday afternoon. The pews were filled with Sarah's family, all firmly middle class, educated, and rooted in the community. John's side looked meager in comparison, just his aging mother and a handful of neighbors who had come out of politeness rather than a close connection. Sarah's parents weren't thrilled about the union but didn't openly oppose it, assuming John would rise to meet their daughter's ambitions. If he didn't, well, they had ways of exerting their influence. From the very first days of their marriage, cracks began to show. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small moments of Sarah's sharp tongue and John's tendency to retreat into silence. "John, did you forget to take the trash out again?" she'd say with a sigh, standing in the tiny kitchen of their rented house. "It's not that hard, you know." He'd mumble an apology and shuffle outside, his shoulders slightly hunched. "It's like he's not even trying sometimes," Sarah would later vent to her mother during their weekly phone calls. "I mean, I love him, but he doesn't act like he's a grown man. I've got 2 jobs at school and he can't even handle fixing the faucet without me nagging him about it." The criticisms didn't stop with household matters. Sarah, sharp-eyed and quick to spot flaws, began to focus on John's quiet demeanor and lack of ambition. To her, he was content with mediocrity, happy to repair engines at the shop and mow the lawn on Sundays. "I'm not asking for a millionaire, John," she said to him one evening over dinner, "but don't you want something more for us? You're smarter than this. Why don't you look into getting certified for something better? Hell, even just a supervisory position at the shop wouldn't be a bad place to start." But John wasn't a man built for bold steps or big risks. His military years had taught him to follow orders, keep his head down, and avoid confrontation. The more Sarah pushed, the more he pulled back, retreating into the safety of routine and unspoken resentment. What neither of them understood was that their marriage wasn't built to withstand the weight of unspoken expectations and buried insecurities. On the surface, their life seemed fine: a 3-bedroom house on the edge of town, 2 cars, and eventually 2 children. But Sarah's growing frustration and John's inability to meet her demands began to create a divide that only widened with time. Sarah was an accomplished teacher, well-liked by parents and admired by colleagues. To many, she embodied the modern Southern woman, poised, intelligent, and fiercely independent. At home, however, that same independence often clashed with John's quiet, traditional notions of what a husband and father should be. She would take charge of everything from their finances to the kids' homework, delegating tasks to John only when she felt it absolutely necessary. "God, John, do I have to do everything?" became a recurring phrase in their household. And though John never yelled or argued back, the weight of those words settled into his chest like lead. As time passed, the cracks in their marriage grew more visible. Sarah grew impatient with John's reluctance to speak up or push back, mistaking his quiet nature for indifference. Meanwhile, John began to resent her constant criticisms, storing up every cutting comment and dismissive remark, though he never voiced his frustration. In the small town, whispers began to circulate. Neighbors noticed Sarah chatting animatedly with other men at church while John lingered in the background, silent as ever. Sarah's co-workers at school joked about her fixer-upper husband, sometimes in ways that made her laugh but left her uneasy when she went home to him at night. "They don't mean anything by it, John," she told him once after he overheard a co-worker call him Mr. Can't Get It Together at a school barbecue. "It's just, you've got to admit you're not exactly doing much to prove them wrong." John didn't respond. He avoided her gaze, retreating to the porch where he sat for hours, staring out at the horizon as if the answers to his life's questions might appear out of nowhere. For John, the marriage had gone from a promise of love and stability to a daily exercise in endurance. For Sarah, it had become a failed project, a man she thought she could shape but who had refused to change. Neither realized how dangerous their growing discontent could become, nor how the walls of their home, which once represented a fresh start, would come to hold the bitterness of unspoken words and unmet expectations. What began as a quiet marriage built on compromise would soon devolve into something far darker, with neither John nor Sarah prepared for the consequences of a relationship held together by little more than obligation and sheer willpower. Isolated at work and in social life. ***. After returning to his small southern town, John Miller found a job at a local repair shop fixing industrial equipment. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, enough to buy groceries and keep a roof over his family's head. To outsiders, this seemed like a decent arrangement, especially in a town where jobs were scarce. But for John, the workshop became another prison, one filled with machinery, oil-stained floors, and people who made him feel smaller every single day. The men at the shop weren't kind to someone like John. In a workplace dominated by loud opinions and rough banter, John's quiet, reserved nature stuck out like a sore thumb. The other mechanics were older, tougher, and more experienced. They quickly pegged John as the guy who would never talk back, the one you could shove the dirtiest, most back-breaking tasks on without hearing a word of complaint. "Hey Miller," one of his co-workers barked one Monday morning, tossing a heavy toolbox onto John's work table with a loud clang. "I need you to handle the wheeler job. Transmission's shot and it's a goddamn mess. Nobody feels like touching it today, so it's all yours." John didn't argue, even though that particular piece of equipment was known to be a nightmare to repair. Instead, he nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work under the disdainful stares of his colleagues. They saw him as weak, someone who lacked the confidence to stand up for himself. What they didn't see, what they didn't bother to see, was that John didn't complain because he couldn't afford to lose this job. He couldn't afford to stir the waters in a town where everyone knew each other and held grudges like heirlooms. The teasing wasn't limited to just shop work. During lunch breaks, John often ate alone, sitting quietly on an overturned bucket at the edge of the shop while the others crowded around the table, cracking jokes and downing sandwiches. Sometimes they'd make half-hearted attempts to include him in their conversations, but the tone was always condescending. "So, Miller," one of them drawled one afternoon, his voice dripping with mock curiosity, "you ever think maybe the army should have just kept you? You seemed better suited there, nice and quiet, doing what you're told." The group chuckled, and John forced a polite smile, though his stomach churned. They knew nothing about what his time in the army had cost him, nor did they care. To them, he was just the quiet guy. The odd one out who didn't have the guts to fire back or defend himself. But it wasn't just work that felt isolating. Life in the town didn't offer much reprieve either. John's neighbors viewed him with a mix of pity and mild contempt. He wasn't like the other men, who spent their weekends hunting or drinking beers on their porches, gabbing on about football. He wasn't outspoken, wasn't charming, and wasn't ambitious in the way that small southern towns seem to idolize. Walking into the local diner for breakfast was an exercise in discomfort. The regulars always sat at the same counter stools, their conversations halting briefly when John walked in, only to start again with a whisper or two thrown in his direction. "That's Miller," someone muttered behind their coffee cup. "You know, the one married to Sarah. Lucky girl's got her hands full with that one." Even his wife Sarah seemed to look at him differently as the years passed. She had married John expecting stability, but what she got, in her opinion, was stagnation. To her, John's sense of quiet humility started to look more like a lack of motivation, a refusal to strive for anything greater than what life handed him. "John, people are starting to talk," Sarah said one evening as they sat at their small kitchen table. Her tone was clipped, like she'd rehearsed this conversation in her head all day. You're too okay with settling. You don't have to make millions, but you could be trying harder. Take a night shift. Go for the supervisory role." "I'm doing my best," John replied after a long pause, his voice soft but steady. "Are you?" Sarah shot back, her frustration evident. "Because from where I'm sitting it feels like you're afraid of trying anything new. I mean, what kind of example is that for our kids?" John didn't answer. He didn't know how to because deep down he feared she was right. What kind of example was he setting? The truth was, John felt more alone than he'd ever admit. He didn't feel comfortable at work, in his town, or even in his own home at times. Every space seemed filled with people judging him, misunderstanding him, expecting him to be something he didn't know how to become. At church, where families sat side by side in the worn pews, John often felt like he was on display. Members of the congregation would nod politely as Sarah ushered the kids into their places, but he could feel the unspoken critiques in their glances. "He's not even leading his family," one man whispered to his wife during the sermon, just loud enough for John to hear. "You gotta be strong in this world, and that Miller boy don't got what it takes." These small, relentless moments built up over time. The laughter at his expense, the quiet murmurs, the dismissive gestures, they came together to form a chorus of rejection that echoed in John's mind endlessly. Even when John tried to connect, to reach beyond his circle, things always seemed to backfire. Once he attended a weekend fishing trip with some coworkers in an effort to bond. The trip was supposed to be lighthearted, a chance to blow off steam, but the ribbing turned cruel by midday. "Jesus, Miller, do you even know how to hold a damn rod?" one man teased, after John struggled with a tangled line. "Maybe we should have brought his wife along, bet she'd catch more," another chimed in, grinning. John laughed along weakly, pretending it didn't bother him. But that night, as he sat alone in his truck before driving home, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was simply destined to exist like this, adrift, disconnected and unnoticed except when someone needed to belittle him. The isolation wasn't just external, it seeped into his heart and mind, making him feel like an outsider even in moments of supposed intimacy. By the time the first cracks in his marriage appeared, John had already been living with the heavy burden of loneliness for years. He had no one to confide in, no sanctuary to escape to, and as time passed, he began to wonder if the silence he clung to as a form of self-preservation was slowly suffocating him instead. The complete collapse of the marriage ***. The cracks in John and Sarah's marriage, once hairline fractures hidden beneath a facade of normalcy, had widened into gaping chasms. What little love or affection once existed between them had been eroded by years of cutting words, unmet expectations, and crushing silence. If their life together had begun as an uneasy compromise, it devolved over time into an enduring war of attrition, two people locked in a stalemate of disappointment, resentment, and unspoken pain. It didn't happen overnight. From the outside, their life seemed perfectly ordinary. They lived in a modest home on the edge of town, attended church as a family every Sunday, and raised their two children with what appeared to be a sense of quiet stability. But inside the walls of their house, things were far from stable. Sarah had grown tired of John's inability, or unwillingness, to meet her expectations. She carried the household on her back, shouldering the bulk of responsibility for managing their finances, their children's school activities, and even their future. While she demanded progress, John seemed content to sit back and let life happen to him, refusing, or perhaps incapable, to strive for anything greater than mere survival. "You're so passive," Sarah hissed one night after the children had gone to bed. "Do you even care about us at all, John? Or is this just it for you? Coming home to sit in that damn chair and watch the news every night, that's all you are, isn't it? A chair and a paycheck?" John stirred the ice in his glass of sweet tea, refusing to look at her. He wanted to defend himself, to explain how hard it was to work all day at a job where he felt unseen and disrespected, how defeated he'd felt since leaving the military, but the words never came out. They never did. Instead he muttered, "I'm doing the best I can." Sarah scoffed, throwing her dish rag onto the counter. "No, you're not, John. This isn't your best. This isn't even close. You're coasting, and it's not enough. Not for me, not for these kids." The fight ended the way all their fights did, with Sarah storming off, slamming a door behind her, and John retreating into the dull safety of his self-imposed silence. Whether it happened in the kitchen, the bedroom, or the car, the arguments always came full circle, Sarah venting her frustrations while John absorbed them without a word, sinking deeper into his internal world where no one could reach him. As the years passed, Sarah's sharp words cut deeper. She began to view John not just as complacent, but as a failure. He hadn't become the man she imagined when they married. There was no upward trajectory, no ambition, no drive to make their lives better. She was angry, yes, but beneath the anger was disappointment, a grief for the life she thought she would have and the husband she thought she married. "I'm done enabling you," she said one evening, standing in the doorway of their dimly lit bedroom, her voice low but trembling with rage. "You've turned passivity into an art form, John, and I'm done subsidizing your lack of effort." John, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at his boots, sighed deeply. He didn't have the strength to argue, didn't have the words to make her see the weight he carried every day. So, he said nothing. That silence enraged Sarah even further. "God, you're pathetic!" The words escaped her mouth before she had a chance to pull them back. She saw the way his shoulders sagged, the way he seemed to crumble under the weight of her harshness, but she didn't apologize. She was too tired, too frustrated to care if she'd hurt him. Meanwhile, John's resentment simmered quietly in the background. He hated her for the things she said, hated himself for never standing up to her. Every day felt like another failure piled on top of an already suffocating weight. He hated the house they shared, the town they lived in, the sound of her voice when she criticized him, and worse, the nights she said nothing at all. Silence had become almost more unbearable than the fights. The children, though young, weren't blind to the tension. They saw the way their mother snapped at their father, the way their father's face turned to stone whenever Sarah began one of her tirades. At first, Sarah tried to shield the kids from the worst of it, but as time wore on, she stopped trying. Yelling in the kitchen while the kids watched cartoons in the living room had become almost routine. One night, after a particularly heated fight, Sarah dropped the one bomb she had been holding on to for years. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It spilled out in a moment of unfiltered anger, something she wanted to hurt him with. "You know what, John?" she spat across the table. "You're not even much of a father. Not to me, not to this family. And you know why? Because this family wasn't even all your damn responsibility to begin with." The words lingered in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. It took John a moment to process what she was really saying, but when he did, his stomach tightened and his hands clenched into fists. His voice, usually so quiet you had to strain to hear him, broke through the silence. "What did you just say?" Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze sharp and almost defiant. "You heard me. You think you're doing such a great job as a husband and a dad? You're not, because they're not even—" She stopped, realizing too late that she'd gone too far, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. John stood motionless for a long moment, his face unreadable. He couldn't even feel anger, not yet. What he felt was something deeper than rage, a hollow, devastating betrayal. It was as though the foundation of his entire life had been ripped out from beneath him. "I gave you everything I had," he finally said, his voice cold and steady. "Everything, every damn thing I had to give, and it was never enough for you." "It's not just about me," Sarah shot back, though her voice had softened. There was a flicker of regret in her eyes, but John was too far gone to notice. "You should have done better, John. You should have been better. For them, for yourself, for all of us." John didn't respond this time. He turned and walked out the door, leaving Sarah standing there, unsure if she felt victorious or completely broken. By the time John returned hours later, the house was dark, save for the faint glow of a nightlight in the hallway. He sat down on the porch steps, looking out into the stillness of the empty street. Somewhere deep inside him, something had cracked. Someone had given up. A part of himself that had believed he could salvage what remained of his broken marriage. In that moment, John Miller wasn't angry anymore. He was something worse. He was empty. The moment of losing control and unspeakable violence. Anything sulk asterisk because what? Life didn't gift you the things you wanted? Grow up. You're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. There was something inside of John that snapped. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't even something he fully registered happening. It was like the slow turning of a key, unlocking a door to a part of him he didn't know existed. "You want me to grow up?" he said, his voice almost unnervingly soft. He stood up from the table, his towering frame casting a shadow across the dining room. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Whatever needed to happen next was already written in the deepest, most broken parts of his soul. "Yeah, John," Sarah spat, taking a step closer to him. "Be a fucking man for once in your life." The next moments were a blur of movement, anger, and guttural primal noise. John didn't remember reaching for the heavy wrench he'd left by the side door earlier that day, nor did he remember the sound it made when it connected with Sarah's body. All he could hear, deep, consuming, and deafening, was the sound of years of bitterness leaving him, one terrible blow at a time. Sarah collapsed against the edge of the table, crying out in pain and shock. "John!" she screamed, her voice trembling now, no longer angry but terrified. "John, stop!" But he couldn't. Or maybe he simply didn't want to. His mind was no longer rooted in the present. It was trapped in every failure, every slight, every insult, every moment he'd been made to feel small. The children, hearing the commotion, peeked out of their bedroom door only to freeze where they stood. There was their father, their quiet, solemn father, standing over their mother, breathing heavily with tears streaking his face, wielding violence in a way that made no sense in a home where silence had always been the fiercest weapon. When it was over, the house fell so quiet that John thought for a moment he might have gone deaf. He looked down at Sarah's crumpled form, her lifeless eyes staring up at him with an expression that made his stomach churn. The wrench slipped out of his hand, hitting the floor with a metallic clang. The sound startled him back into reality, but it was too late. His chest heaved as he turned slowly toward the children who were frozen in the hallway, their faces pale with terror. "Go back," he said, his voice breaking. "Go back to your room," he whispered. But the words didn't sound like his own. They sounded foreign, like they came from someone else entirely. In the end, there was no plan. No carefully orchestrated excuses or attempts at redemption. The beast inside of John, the one Sarah had unknowingly awakened long ago, had finally won. And as the silence of the house gave way to the faint sound of sirens in the distance, John realized there was no going back. What he had done had crossed a line no man could uncross. The moment of losing control and unspeakable violence. "Try not asterisk, get to talk to me like that." Sarah pushed back her chair with a harsh screech, standing now, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "You just sit there, day after day, doing the bare goddamn minimum, and now you're going to tell me to shut up? Are you kidding me?" John's jaw clenched tightly, and for the first time, he looked her directly in the eye. His voice was quieter now, but somehow heavier, weighted with something neither Sarah nor the kids had ever heard from him. "You want to know what I think, Sarah?" he said, his tone measured and slow. I think you should have kept your mouth shut 5 years ago when this all started. When you decided that I wasn't worth respecting anymore." Sarah recoiled slightly, more out of shock than fear. "Excuse me?" she spat. "You think you're so damn perfect," John continued, pushing his chair back as he stood to full height. "You think you're holding this family together? All you do is tear it down, me, the kids, everything. You've been doing it for years." "Oh, please," Sarah snapped back, stepping closer to him now. "You want to talk about who's tearing this family down? Look in the mirror. You're the one who—" She never finished the sentence. He couldn't remember the exact moment he felt his restraint shatter, couldn't recall the split-second decision that led him to grab the wrench he'd left near the back door after working on the car earlier that evening. All he remembered later was the sound, the heavy, sickening thud that seemed to echo long after the room went silent. Sarah crumpled to the floor, her cries of pain barely audible over the pounding in John's ears. Somewhere in the distance he thought he heard the muffled screams of his children, but he couldn't be sure. Time slowed as he stared at Sarah's body, sprawled awkwardly on the kitchen tiles, her breathing ragged and uneven. The wrench felt impossibly heavy in his hand now, and when it finally fell from his grip, it landed with a metallic clang that seemed to shatter the silence. In that moment, John felt hollow, not triumphant, not remorseful, just empty. Behind him, the children huddled in the hallway, crying softly but saying nothing. They were too afraid to speak, too afraid to do anything other than watch from the shadows. John turned to them slowly, his expression unreadable, his eyes distant. "Go to your room," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Go to your room now." They didn't move at first, their small bodies rooted in shock and fear, but eventually they obeyed, shuffling silently down the hallway as though trying not to make a sound. By the time John heard the faint wail of approaching sirens in the distance, he was still standing in the same spot, motionless, staring down at Sarah, surrounded by a mess he knew he could never clean up. The town's shocking massacre. The first shot, the co-workers. The fallout, the aftermath. Asterisk, asterisk. When the news hit the town, it didn't just rattle people. It broke the very fabric of the community. This wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened. People here married young, raised their kids in clapboard houses and lived out their days peacefully, steeped in quiet traditions. But now, they had to reckon with the idea that someone like John Miller, someone they'd spent years ignoring or belittling, could harbor a monster like this within him. Survivors whispered of the quiet moments leading up to the massacre. Maybe if someone had taken him aside, maybe if someone had extended an olive branch when he was at his lowest, things could have been different. But in truth, no one knew how to reckon with what they'd done, or undone, in him. And as John sat in a metal cell, alone and blank-faced, the town's wounds continued to fester, its gossip-laden whispers quieter now, laced with fear of who else might break under the weight of it all. The manhunt and tragic finale. The search begins, the community in fear. The standoff. The aftermath, asterisk, asterisk. The announcement of John Miller's death swept across the town like a cold, suffocating wave. For some, it was a relief, an ending to the nightmare that had gripped their quiet lives, but for others, it left behind a hollow ache, a sense of confusion and guilt that whispered, "Could we have done something to stop this?" In the weeks that followed, the funerals came one after another, their somber processions winding through the town's narrow streets. The local paper released story after story about the victims, about the tragedy of good lives snuffed out too soon by a man they'd once known so well, and John's name became a ghost, spoken only in hushed tones if at all. To many, he was a monster. To a select few, he was a warning, and to his children, he became a shadow of questions that would linger over their lives for years to come. In the small southern town where nothing extraordinary was ever supposed to happen, the scars of that night would never fully heal. The trial and final sentence, the trial's first day, setting the scene. The evidence piles on John's own words, asterisk, asterisk. The most haunting moment of the trial came when John was finally asked to testify. Taking the stand, he shuffled slightly in his seat, his chained wrists clinking together as he adjusted the microphone. His lawyer whispered quietly in his ear, but John simply raised his palm in acknowledgement and looked out at the eyes staring back at him, each pair filled with pain, anger, or disbelief. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Miller?" Marianne's voice cut bluntly through the room. "Yes," John said. His voice wasn't strong, it was hoarse, like a man coming out of a long night of shouting only to find that no one had listened. "I never wanted it to be this way. I didn't wake up planning to hurt anyone," he began, pausing for a moment before continuing. "But everything had been piling on for years. All the whispers, all the jokes, everything she said." He didn't flinch at the audible gasps and stifled outrage cutting through the once silent room, but his breathing quickened. "I wasn't trying to destroy the world," he continued, his lips trembling. "I just wanted to destroy the part of it that destroyed me." That single line would be quoted in papers, editorialized, and condemned by reporters and psychologists alike for decades to come. The verdict was unanimous. The jury spent less than 2 hours deliberating before returning with their decision. Guilty on all 10 counts of murder. It was no surprise to anyone when the judge pronounced the sentence, death by lethal injection. The sentence did little to calm the victims' families. Tears filled their eyes, but there was no sense of relief. Justice couldn't bring back those they'd lost. For John's mother, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom with a tissue pressed to her lips, the words were both devastating and inevitable. When she visited him one last time in prison, she asked him if he was afraid. He shook his head slowly and whispered, "No, Mama, I've been dead for a long time, this is just catching up with me." John Miller's trial became a story told in criminology classes, psychology seminars, and moral debates across the nation. People referenced it as a cautionary tale, a tragic example of loneliness, anger, and mental illness metastasizing into catastrophe. For the town, however, it was more than a story, it was an eternal wound. Even as years passed, no gravestone was placed for John Miller. His name faded from most lips, spoken only in passing as the monster we didn't see coming. But his children, the ones left behind, carried his shadow with them wherever they went, asking the same question that haunted everyone else. Hidden anguish from tragedy and revelations born too late. When the chaos finally settled and the sound of sirens faded from the small southern town of Pinesville, what remained was not just tragedy, but an eerie silence. It was the silence of unanswered questions, the gnawing moments when people revisited the choices they had made, the things they said and didn't say, the times they looked away. As details of John Miller's violent end surfaced, the townsfolk were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about a man who broke. It was about the cracks in the community that let him fall through. Whispers of regret. The days after the massacre became a blur of funerals, whispered condolences, and awkward exchanges in grocery store parking lots. For the first time, neighbors who had once freely judged John and Sarah's marriage now avoided one another's gaze. To outward observers, small towns are often idealized as tight-knit communities, places where everyone knows everyone, where shared values are ingrained like the cracks on a weathered church steeple. But in the case of John Miller, their closeness became a blade that cut both ways. It started with the people who knew him best, or thought they did. His co-workers at the repair shop recalled how he would arrive early every morning, brown bags slung over his shoulder, ready to work without complaint. But now, those same men who had laughed at his quiet demeanor sat in their trucks with cigarette smoke curling around their heads, wondering if their teasing had gone too far. "I used to call him Silent John," one of his co-workers admitted in hushed tones to the local paper. "Figured it was harmless, you know? Just some friendly ribbing between guys. Never thought he was holding on to that." His voice cracked as he trailed off, the weight of his words settling like lead in the air. Even Russ's widow, just weeks after her husband had been shot in the very store he'd built from the ground up, couldn't help but question the interactions her spouse had had with John. "I can remember times Russ would say things," she murmured. "Off-handed little comments like, 'Poor Sarah, stuck with him.'" She lowered her tear-streaked face into a tissue. "I don't know, maybe we were all wrong about him in ways we couldn't see. The silent weight of a lifetime." The deeper wounds came from those closer to John, people who should have known him beyond the surface impressions he left behind. His mother, Mary Ann Miller, a frail woman in her late 60s, became the quiet focal point of public pity. She had attended every day of her son's trial, sitting with her hands folded tightly over the Bible John's father had once owned, a Bible she gave him when he was old enough to understand that life wouldn't be fair. "He never told me how bad it got," she said softly to a reporter brave enough to knock on her door weeks later. Her modest home, once filled with the warmth of her family, had become cold and barren, nearly mirroring the family dynamics she could no longer ignore. "Maybe he thought I couldn't handle it. Maybe I didn't ask the right questions." Mary Ann held tight to memories of John's early life, back when he was a boy who loved to fix things. He would shadow his father in the garage, taking apart radios and piecing them back together. She spoke fondly of his patience, his uncanny ability to make broken things whole again, as though the world's seams could always be mended, until they couldn't. "He was a quiet boy," she continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "But that wasn't a bad thing back then, or at least we didn't think so." Her teary eyes turned toward a photo on the mantel, a dusty frame holding an image of John as a young man in his army uniform. "I thought the war might bring something good out in him. He didn't talk much after coming home, but I thought that was normal. I didn't know it was because he was hurting. A town's quiet guilt." The tragedy didn't just bury 10 residents of Pinesville, it unearthed something sinister about how people interacted in their quiet little town. John Miller's outburst of violence lay bare years of isolation and unspoken grievances. And while John alone bore the burden of his crimes, the community began to examine their own complicity in creating the conditions for such a breakdown. In the weeks that followed the trial, church sermons turned somber, no longer focusing on broad biblical themes, but instead digging into the fractures within their congregation. "How do we love thy neighbor?" asked Pastor Will Jenkins one Sunday morning. His voice trembled from the pulpit, where he had spent years preaching about grace and understanding, never imagining that such a horrifying example of their absence would strike his flock. When did we start caring more about appearances than about understanding one another? At potlucks and PTA meetings, whispers grew louder, though not in the typical gossip-filled manner. It wasn't about casting blame this time, it was about confronting their shared experiences with John and whether they'd failed him in ways subtle but no less damaging. There was the schoolteacher who remembered John as a child drawing quietly in the back corner of her first-grade classroom. "I used to think he was just a dreamy little boy all stuck in his head," she admitted to a reporter. "But, looking back on it now, maybe I should have asked him why." The mechanic at the shop confessed hesitantly over drinks. "We thought making fun of him was harmless, you know? That's just how we make the days go by. But those jokes, we didn't realize how much he was carrying before he ever sat at that desk." And the women from Sarah's social circle, who had seen her sharpness toward John on countless occasions but had chosen not to intervene, now grieved in ways laced with guilt. "She could be so hard on him," said one friend. "We would joke about it even, how he just got quieter every year. None of us thought this could happen." Lessons left scarred. The story of John Miller became a cautionary tale, an allegory passed down with varying levels of honesty depending on who told it. For criminologists, it was called a case of unchecked mental turmoil, compounded by years of subtle emotional abuse. For psychologists, it underscored the dangers of ignoring quiet suffering in a culture that equates silence with strength. But for Pinesville, John wasn't a case study or an archetype, he was one of them. Residents became hesitant to make eye contact with their neighbors in the months that followed, not out of distrust but because the weight of unspoken words now felt heavier. Perhaps the most devastating morning came from John's children. Both young and small, they had been mostly shielded from details of the tragedy by the adults around them. But as the years passed, as they grew up with whispers following them wherever they went, they couldn't dodge one harsh truth. They were the legacy of John Miller, a man who had once been their gentle, soft-spoken father. A final reflection. Looking back, the town of Pinesville could only wish it had recognized John Miller's breaking point before it was too late. But in the wake of such violence, the community found small ways to rebuild. Acts of kindness extended just a little further, silences filled with prayers instead of judgment. Through their grief, guilt, and quiet conversations, the people of Pinesville finally realized one terrible, irrevocable truth. You never truly know how heavy someone else's world is until it collapses. The weight of society and lessons from the case. The story of John Miller is no longer just a tale of a man who broke under pressure. It's not just about a tragic moment of violence or the painful loss of 10 lives. It's about the weight a society places on people and the unseen burdens they carry until they're unable to anymore. For many in the small southern town of Pinesville, the aftermath of John's crimes forced a reckoning, not just with him, but with themselves. There was a collective realization, harsh and inescapable, that while John Miller pulled the trigger, the cracks in the social fabric of their town had helped load the gun. The invisible expectations of small-town life in Pinesville was predictable, monotonous even. The town was the kind of place where everybody knew your name, your family, your business, and your mistakes. It wasn't a bad town. It was a place of Sunday church services, backyard barbecues, and neighborly hellos across squeaky picket fences. But under that friendly surface was an undercurrent of judgment, an unspoken pressure to conform to the roles society assigned you. For men like John, those roles were clear: provider, breadwinner, handyman, stoic guardian of the household. In a town like Pinesville, men weren't supposed to show weakness. Struggles with mental health, lingering trauma from military service, or quiet frustrations with life weren't things you discussed. You sucked it up, finished the job, and never said a word. For years, John had tried to walk that line, keeping his head down, doing what needed to be done, but the weight of those expectations became heavier with each passing day, especially when the whispers started. "Poor Sarah," people would say behind his back. "That Miller boy, he's got no ambition, he's just there." What no one saw was the quiet struggle John faced, the growing disillusionment, the sense of failure that gnawed at him every time someone laughed at one of his mistakes or dismissed him as lazy or useless. The louder the town's judgment became, the smaller John felt, and yet, like so many men in communities like Pinesville, he said nothing. He didn't push back against the criticism, he didn't confide in anyone, Not his friends, not his wife, not the pastor. John carried the emotional weight alone, believing it was his cross to bear. A community that brushed off red flags. In the aftermath of the tragedy, many people in Pinesville began to ask themselves hard questions. Why didn't they see it coming? Why didn't anyone step in? The truth was they had seen warning signs. They just hadn't known what to make of them. Some had noticed how quiet John had become over the years. At the shop, he'd kept to himself, rarely joining in on the joking banter of his co-workers. When someone teased him, he'd simply smile thinly and turn back to his work. On Sundays, he sat in the back pew at church, staring at the stained glass as though he were miles away, even as others sang hymns around him. Even Sarah's sharp remarks, delivered loudly enough for neighbors to overhear, had raised eyebrows. "I thought they were just having a rough patch," one woman said later. "It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Everybody fights, right?" But hindsight has a way of sharpening the truth, and in the wake of the killings, it became impossible to ignore how many red flags had been brushed aside. The silent stigma of mental health. If there was one topic the people of Pinesville avoided, it was mental health. Therapy was something big city people did, not something you needed when you had faith, family, and a strong work ethic. For men like John, the stigma was even greater. To admit you were struggling was to risk being seen as weak, incapable, a failure of a man. In John's mind, his silence was a form of protection, a way of proving to himself and others that he could handle the weight. But in reality, that silence was a slow-acting poison, isolating him further with each passing year. He came back from the army different, John's old high school friend said during a news interview. He was always a quiet guy, but after he served, it was like something was gone from him. I told him to join the VFW, talk to the other veterans, but he just shook his head, said it wasn't his thing. I should have tried harder. John's isolation wasn't unique. Many in town carried their own burdens, traumas, regrets, fears, but there was an unspoken rule in Pinesville. You dealt with your problems in private. After all, to admit you needed help was to open yourself up to gossip and speculation, two things no one wanted to face. The pressure cooker of gender roles. The tragedy also brought to light the unyielding pressure of traditional gender expectations in the town. Men like John were expected to provide, to protect, to work hard without complaint, and when they fell short, even slightly, they were ridiculed or dismissed. Women, too, were weighed down by societal standards. Sarah had her own pressures to contend with, balancing her work as a teacher, raising 2 children, and maintaining the image of a perfect Southern wife. Her frustrations with John, his quiet nature, his reluctance to push for a better job, were likely rooted in her own fears. Fears that they would never escape their small-town life, never be more than what the community expected of them. But instead of addressing their struggles together, John and Sarah became locked in a cycle of resentment and unmet expectations, each feeling like the other wasn't doing enough. Lessons learned too late. In the weeks and months after the massacre, Pinesville began to grapple with the deeper lessons of John Miller's story. It wasn't just about one man's mental breakdown or a struggling marriage. It was about the way communities like theirs inadvertently create conditions for tragedy to unfold. Church leaders began speaking openly about mental health, urging their congregations to treat it as seriously as physical health. The local library started hosting seminars on recognizing the signs of emotional distress. Even the older men at the repair shop, the ones who had spent years ribbing each other to pass the time, began to rethink their words. "Maybe it's not so harmless," said one of John's former co-workers, staring out at the empty parking lot. "Maybe the things we say, maybe they matter more than we think." For John's mother, the lessons carried a more personal weight. "I wish I had told him it was okay to not be okay," she said in an interview. "I wish I'd told him he didn't have to carry everything alone." Rebuilding with empathy. The wounds John Miller left behind weren't just physical. They were emotional, societal, deeply rooted in the ways people treat one another. Pinesville couldn't undo the tragedy, but slowly the community began to rebuild itself with small acts of kindness and understanding. At the local diner, the waitress now asked her regulars, "How are you really doing?" The local high school added lessons on emotional intelligence to its curriculum. And at church, rather than whispering about their neighbors' struggles, people began saying, "How can I help?" A final reflection. The lessons from John Miller's case weren't easy to swallow. They forced the community to confront its own shortcomings, its own failures to see the pain hidden in plain sight. But in the end, those lessons carried a simple and